Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be astonished to find some interesting similarities between some of the ancient Western world's greatest thinkers and India's yogis. This includes the belief in karma and reincarnation. Will there be ashrams in Europe 2,500 years ago? Greek philosophers studying in India? Well, what about meditation classes in ancient Rome? On the program today, we're joined by a writer who shuttles back and forth between two universes, the modern Western world and India. She has published more than 200 articles on topics related to yoga and Hindu spirituality in many magazines, including Yoga Plus and Yoga International, and she has written more than 8 books on the particular subject. Today we're going to be talking about her latest book, Lost Masters, Rediscovering the Mysticism of Ancient Greek Philosophers. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Linda Johnson. Linda, thank you for joining us here on the program.
I so appreciate your having me here to talk about my favorite subject in the world.
Well, I could see that by the way you wrote about it. First of all, just to let the listeners know, this is a book definitely worth reading. I like the simplicity of how you wrote it, but it's astonishingly interesting, and that's what I like about how you start your first chapter off, is that, you know, universities seem to take a topic and they did something that seemed almost impossible. They made it boring.
Yeah. I always thought that the ancient Greeks were, as relevant to our lives today as bows and arrows. I I took a class in college on ancient Greek philosophy, and it was the most boring class that I ever took. But once I began researching what they were actually saying, it turned out the Greeks were a lot more like us than we ever expected, and they were not boring at all. We hear that we're always told they were the founders of scientific materialism. But what they tell us about themselves is they were intensely interested in spirituality. As you were pointing out, many of them believed in karma and reincarnation. A lot of them were vegetarian. They meditated. They studied near-death experiences. They fought for animal rights. They tried to understand God and the nature of their own souls. They were Greeks, and they had a very rational approach to all of this. But they did not consider metaphysical subjects off limits like a lot of scientific types do today.
I always found that interesting, too. I remember back when I was becoming, say, steeped in religious pursuit or my spirituality, whatever you want to call it, that there was an interesting, you can call it a paradox, where they would believe, and you wrote this in your book, that if you were religious, you couldn't be scientific, and if you were scientific, you couldn't be religious. But to me, you seem to really need both if you're going to pursue things beyond what you know.
Oh, absolutely. And the founders of Western civilization recognize that. Scholars today are fully aware of all this spirituality in the ancient Greek sources, but they ignore it. They say it's Oriental contamination of pure, rational Western thought. They find it embarrassing that many of the founders of Western civilization were nowhere nearly as committed to materialism as academics are today. The Greeks were curious and open-minded, and when we search intelligently for a deeper understanding of our spiritual nature, we are not betraying the Western intellectual tradition. We're just following in the footsteps of its founders. Would you mind if I tell you a story or two about the ancient Greeks?
That's what we're open to.
Let's do that.
As impassioned as you were, I figured I was just going to push the button and you were going to go, and our listeners are just going to be amazed by what they hear.
Well, let's start around 600 B.C. Let's talk about Pythagoras. He was the guy who invented the theorem that we learned in math class. How uninteresting is that? And I was astonished to find that he actually founded a hugely successful spiritual community in Italy. So this is like 600 centuries before Christ. His followers meditated, they ate no meat, drank no alcohol, worked out every day, got massages, practiced music therapy, and tried to reach a state of enlightenment. Now, Pythagoras spent decades studying with spiritual masters in Egypt and Syria and Persia, and according to one source, even with the Hindu Brahmins. And get this, his first teacher was Thales. Now, I remember in grade school, we heard that Thales was the father of Western science. But it was Thales who encouraged Pythagoras to go to Egypt, because Thales himself had studied with the priests there. It's actually a myth that the ancient Greek thinkers were self-educated geniuses who came up with all their ideas by themselves. You know, many of them studied abroad. Let me also tell you something else here. Empedocles, I also remember him from grade school. He was the guy that we were told was the first to teach that matter is made of elements. But there's a lot of things about him that we never heard. He was a doctor, but his main interest, according to the ancient sources, was, and I quote here, curing souls. He was a hugely popular public speaker, and whenever he would give talks, huge crowds would come to hear him. And so what was Empedocles telling people, was critical to their health and well-being. Empedocles told them to meditate. Here's what he said. You must plunge beneath the crowded thoughts in your mind and calmly contemplate higher realities with pure, focused attention. Then a state of tranquility will remain with you throughout your life. But if instead you direct your attention to the trivial things most people obsess about, the silly nonsense that dulls their minds, then all you'll get are physical things that you'll just lose anyway. He taught reincarnation. I don't want to spend a lot of time just quoting, but there's one more quote I just have to read to you. It's a short one. Okay, so here's Empedocles, who scientists today consider, one of the earliest scientists. Here is how Empedocles described God. He said, "The divine isn't something you can see with your eyes or hold in your hands. It doesn't have a face or feet or gender, but is pure consciousness whose awareness extends throughout the entire cosmos. It is nothing but consciousness in every direction and eternally rejoices in the encircling silence." Now, Daniel, today we call this Eastern philosophy. 2,500 years ago, this was Western philosophy. I was looking at all these sources, Diogenes Laertius, Diodorus Siculus, Arian, Stobaeus, works of Plato, Plotinus, fragments of Empedocles, Heraclitus, and on, dozens and dozens and dozens of ancient texts. And when I was in college, my Jesuit professor in our Greek philosophy course told me, okay, here's the parts of Plato that you read, and skip these other parts. They're just, superstition, and it shows that even as great a thinker as Plato, wasn't, had this dark and silly side to him. But when I went back and started looking at all this material, that's where I found the juice. The Greeks were on fire with fascination with spiritual truths. Now, there were exceptions. We know Democritus, for example, who was the founder of the atomic theory, was an atheist, and Epicurus, who founded Epicureanism, was agnostic. But so many of the teachers that I looked back into, that I read their works or what has survived of their works, they were just on fire with fascination with spiritual life. There was even an ancient Greek word I was astonished to discover. The word is kenosis. Ken is Greek for one, O-N-E, one. So kenosis means a state of oneness. And the Greeks had all these spiritual practices that they cultivated in order to attain that state of oneness with divine being or with their own higher selves. And any of your listeners who've taken yoga classes, you've heard of samadhi. You know, you practice these samadhi techniques of meditation to attain higher states of oneness. And the word yoga literally means, you know, oneness, attaining union with the one. Henosis and yoga mean the same thing. It was mind blowing. Another thing I'll just mention, Daniel. Did you know that Alexander the Great had a guru?
No, and that was really interesting to find that out. You wouldn't think somebody of his stature would have somebody he gets advice from or learns from.
I just couldn't believe it. But there are numerous ancient sources because Alexander, as he was traveling around the world, you know, conquering one country after another, he had these guys who were the equivalent of what we would call reporters today, who were traveling with him and recording, you know, all the major episodes and what he was saying and what he was doing. And we learned that virtually the first thing he did when he reached India was send his men out to find some of these yogis that he'd been hearing about. And he actually found a guru named Kalyana, who he took with him back to Persia. And there was just amazing stories about Alexander and the yogis. If you don't mind, I'll tell you one of them because this one it just so blew my mind.
Yes, please do.
The very first yogi that the reconnaissance team, Alexander's reconnaissance team, found was a yogi named Dunda. And so the Greek scouts gave him a message from Alexander, and the message went. I'm going to read here for you because this is straight out of the Greek sources. So they're telling him, Alexander, son of Zeus and sovereign of the entire earth, commands you to come at once. If he is pleased with you, he will reward you richly. If not, he will kill you. And this, according to the sources, is what Dunda answered Alexander. He said, there is only one supreme king, the one who created light and life. This is the only king I obey, and he abhors war. How can this Alexander be supreme ruler as long as he himself is subject to the king of death? And what can he offer me when my mother, the earth, already provides everything I need? I have no possessions I need to guard, so I sleep peacefully at night. Alexander can kill my body, but he can't touch my soul. Tell your king that at the time of death, each of us is called to account for our deeds. Ask him how he's going to explain the agony of those he has murdered and oppressed. He can tempt those who crave gold. He can terrify those who fear death. But we yogis care for neither. Tell your Alexander he has nothing I want, and I will not come to him. And this is kind of, I mean, it's just like someone actually saying this to Alexander the Great, you know, who's just like conquered most of the known world at that time. But what's even more famous is Alexander's response to Dunda. So the reporters who traveled with him recorded that when Alexander heard what Dunda had the message Dunda sent back to him, he said, I, the conqueror of the world, have just been conquered by a naked old man. So we see over and over again how amazed the Greeks were at the yogis. Alexander found one yogi who actually, Kalyana, who reluctantly agreed to travel back with him towards Persia. Because Alexander was not able to conquer India. It was the first culture he was not able to conquer. So he heads back homewards towards Greece with Kalyana. But as you can imagine, Alexander was not that good of a student. I mean, we don't know a lot about his relationship with Kalyana, but we do know that, you know, Alexander was, a raving alcoholic and was homicidal, and power had really gone to his head towards the very end of his life. He was in bad shape. And Kalyana just became so disgusted with the Greeks that he decided he wanted to go back to India. But he went back to India the way that yogis do, which is it was too far to walk, so he didn't want to bother to take his body. So he actually built a large pyre and lit it, and then went and sat down in the pyre to burn his body to free his soul, so he could just return and reincarnate in India. And so the Greek soldiers there, they're like freaking out as they watch this yogi just completely calmly, go and sit down in the fire and burn away his aged body with no sign of pain, just completely focused on the divine within. And the Greeks were galvanized by this. And they brought these stories about the yogis and these great sages that they discovered in India back to Greece. Some major teachers in the Greek tradition actually lived for some time in India. Pyrrho and Anaxarchus lived in India maybe about a year and a half. And skipping forward to the 1st century, let me just, if people are interested, let me tell you about Apollonius of Tyana. When we think of the Roman Empire in the 1st century A.D., and who was the most famous saint and sage at that time? Well, obviously we think about Jesus, I have a very, very, very strong Christian background. And of course, you think about Jesus. But what most of us don't realize was that in the 1st century, Jesus was not really that well known. The best-known sage in the Roman Empire during Jesus' lifetime was Apollonius of Tyana. He was another physician, actually, who lived in what we would call Turkey now. And very, very, very famous in the ancient Greek world. And he actually went on a pilgrimage to India, and records of his experiences in India have just almost miraculously survived to the modern time. So we know about some of his experiences there. He actually arrived in the northwestern part of India and studied in a Hindu ashram. And everywhere he went after that, Turkey, Greece, Rome, Spain, North Africa, he would tell people about the yogis, who he said were the wisest, most amazing human beings he had ever met. And in the book, I described some of the things that were some of the Vedic sciences, some of the ancient yogic sciences that he studied while he was in India. And I just, I don't want to belabor this, but I have to tell you that when he came back to the Greek world, to the Greeks and Romans, there were 2 great spiritual civilizations in the world that they knew of, Egypt and India. And so having just met these incredible masters in India, Apollonius decided to travel down to Egypt because he wanted to meet the Hierophants and great teachers there. It turned out he was actually a little bit disappointed with the Egyptian teachers because by this time, Egypt had been taken over by the Persian Zoroastrians, and then it had been taken over by the Hyksos before that. And it had been invaded so many times that their spiritual tradition was getting weaker and weaker. But what remained of it, just what blew Apollonius away, was how similar their teachings and even some of their mythology was, and even some of the words that they used were to Indian religion and mythology and practice. He found that some of the esoteric teachings of the Egyptians were virtually identical to what we learn about in our yoga and meditation classes now. He actually theorized that in vast antiquity, a community of teachers from India must have migrated to North Africa and taught some of this stuff to the Egyptians. Now, Daniel, I'm not saying that I believe that's historically true. I mean, that would need a lot more research to prove. But it shows that someone who was familiar with both the spiritual traditions of Egypt and India thought, gosh, they're like amazingly similar. And just in case there's anyone out there listening who is interested in ancient Egypt, there are traditions from the Egyptians themselves, whether or not it's historically true, but it's legendary, that Osiris, the god king of Egypt, that he actually went to India. And at the end of Egyptian civilization, we all have heard of Cleopatra. And we heard about how she, when Mark Antony, her champion, was killed, she committed suicide, by ash poison. But killing herself was not her original backup plan in case they lost against Octavian, Caesar Augustus, who was trying to take over Egypt. Her original plan was to go to India, and she only killed herself after Octavian's forces, captured the boats that she was going to flee to India on. There were connections between Egypt and India going way, 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 way back. We have this idea in our mind that all these different cultures were so remote from each other and there was like no contact between them. But in fact, merchants were trading back and forth all the time. And so we shouldn't really be surprised that people who were on a quest for wisdom would travel to other cultures and learn from them. It all is just like so mind-blowing to me, Daniel. It was like, it gave me a completely new perspective on our ancient Western civilization. Most of us have already heard about, yoga and meditation techniques from India, or about Sufism, or about Kabbalah. But what we don't know about is our own Western spiritual heritage.
Right.
We don't even know it existed. This is I'm talking about the pre-Christian Western tradition, but it's so ironic to me now that there are some places in the United States where they're trying to keep yoga out of public schools. And the excuse is that, well, yoga is a completely different tradition, has nothing to do with our Western civilization. But this shows, how closely related our Western civilization was to yogic ideals and yogic understanding, thousands of years ago.
Linda, I was going to point out something, too, that was interesting, that you touched on that particular point, and that we hold on to that belief as strong as we do. Sometime back, we ended up doing a segment on Jesus of Nazareth. And this was a book that was actually written by a gentleman who was an auditor, I guess, medical auditor, but it's, somebody who's pretty meticulous and thorough. And as you read this, you're interested to know that there were two thoughts of religious movement. There was what was known as a Jesus movement and a Christ movement, okay? Mm-hmm. And, one was pretty much based, you just have to have faith, whereas the other one you had to have faith and action, okay? Right. Now, what was interesting, because it's been kind of debated, did Jesus Christ actually ever really exist? Now, when you read your book, it's interesting because here you're all the way over the Greeks and you talk about Orpheus and Dionysus. And sort of that same idea is there as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
I actually did postgraduate work in ancient, early Christian history. I mean, this is fascinating topic, huge topic. But there was the Gnostic tradition, and as you know, in the 1940s, all these Gnostic texts, a whole library of texts was discovered in Egypt, actually, in Nag Hammadi. And it's mind-blowing material to read. It's the mystical side of Christianity. And that was one thing I always wondered, why wasn't there that much more mysticism in the Bible? There was a lot of ethics but not much mysticism. And this shows, there was a strongly mystical side to early Christianity. and they meditated well, anyway, that's a huge other topic. But address specifically what you're asking about, Orpheus and Dionysus. Really, really surprisingly, when archaeologists, started exploring some of the early Christian catacombs, what they found there weren't images of Jesus as we think of Jesus today, but there were images of Jesus in the form of Orpheus. And Orpheus was a prehistoric, a spiritual teacher, actually from the area we now call Bulgaria, who came in and just really had a huge impact in ancient Greece after he studied in Egypt. And he came back and started teaching karma and reincarnation. And it sounds like I'm making this up. I'm not making this up. I mean, check out the Orphic hymns. Check out, the history of the Orphic and Dionysian mystery religions. I mean, this is actually true. And the ancient, the early Christians noted all these amazing similarities between Jesus and Orpheus. So sometimes they actually depicted Jesus, holding the lyre like Orpheus does, a ring, that sort of cap like Orpheus wears, and because Orpheus was originally, long before Jesus was even born, he was called, the shepherd of men, and numbers of the title, the fisherman of men, and titles that later were shifted to Jesus originally were Orpheus's. And Dionysus, the Orphic and Dionysian, and also the Eleusinian mystery traditions. You would participate in this ritual where you would be given bread that was the bread of the deity, and wine that was the blood of the deity. Now, to us, when we hear that, we think about communion, Eucharist, in the Christian church, and it's just really, really surprising to discover that Jesus was not really creating a new mystery or a new a sacrament. He was actually just repeating the sacrament that the ancient Greeks used to have. And we think of Jesus as being so Jewish, and strict Jews would not practice pagan practices, but Jesus was incorporating unmistakably pagan practices into his religious system, and that was really, really surprising. We also know that Jesus was really concerned about. He was very interested in India. And there's speculation that Jesus may have traveled to India. Disappointingly, I mean, I thought I would write a book about that, so I really looked very, very, very closely at the evidence, and it was a little disappointing. I'm not going to put out a book under my name unless I'm really confident about what I'm saying. And the evidence that Jesus himself went to India turned out not to be as strong as I hoped. But what there's unequivocal evidence in both ancient Christianity in the West and in India is that Jesus sent his disciple Thomas to India. And Thomas actually has always been my favorite character in the Bible other than Jesus himself, because, doubting Thomas, I mean, Thomas is the one who needed evidence before he believed. And so I have a lot in common with him. I have the same attitude, actually. And Jesus sent Thomas to India, and so in the 1st century A.D., a direct disciple of Jesus was already in India. So connections between Christianity and India, as well as between early Christianity and Zoroastrianism. The Magi, the Persian priests who came according to the Bible, according to the Gospels, came to visit Jesus just shortly after he was born. And all these connections with ancient mystery traditions, in early Christianity. And it's not so much that has been lost, as, in my opinion, as that it was expunged. It was really wiped out. And just as a person who was raised Christian and went to all Christian schools from kindergarten through postgraduate studies, really learning about the side of Christianity that we were not told about in grade school, that was really, really eye-opening for me, I have to say. Anyway, I have written for numerous yoga magazines. Yoga International, Yoga Plus, Yoga Journal, Lost, Light of Consciousness, and so on and so on. And years ago, because Yoga International was so open-minded, they were just fabulous. So they actually let me write an article for them about Apollonius of Tyana, the Greek sage who went and studied with yogis in India. And they put that on the cover of the magazine, and there was a huge response, because people had never heard about these connections between the ancient Greek thinkers and ancient Greek sages in India. And so they asked me to write another article, so I wrote an article about Plotinus. And then they asked me to write a book. And so I wrote the first edition of Lost Masters years and years ago, and they marketed it basically to the yoga students who read Yoga International magazine. And then what happened was that recently Eckhart Tolle, who wrote a really, really huge international bestseller called The Power of Now, as well as The New Earth, and A New Earth, and he happened to find a copy of this, and he got really, really excited about this material because people here in the West don't know about our own spiritual heritage. And so he asked the publishing company he works with, the World Library, to buy the rights to my book. And then we put out this expanded edition with more stories from the ancient Greeks. And Eckhart very graciously volunteered to write the introduction to the book. And so now this is out, and we're just looking to see, if you're interested, I just want people to know how exciting the Greek philosophers were, how amazing their lives were, that they studied with the wise men of older spiritual cultures around them, like the Magi from Persia and the Chaldeans from Iraq, as well as, teachers from Egypt, and in some cases, even in India. And people should know about philosophers like Plato and Plotinus and Proclus and Hypatia, and the absolutely mind-blowing things that they were teaching thousands of years ago. The other thing that I really wanted people to learn about, because it's just a crime that people who are interested in spirituality here in the West don't know about this, and that's the Corpus Hermetica. Absolutely astonishing ancient texts which meld the ancient Egyptian and Greek wisdom traditions together. When these texts were rediscovered in the 1400s, they helped spark the European Renaissance. And I quote from them in the book. I'll introduce you to them in the book, and it will blow your mind to see how close they were to the teachings of India. So what I'm doing is I'm inviting readers to explore their long-forgotten Western spiritual heritage, because it will challenge everything you thought you knew about the men and women who founded Western civilization.
And I think that's very necessary, too, because you need to challenge a lot of, if you happen to have rigid beliefs in something, to really see things as they truly are, and, to help you evolve as well and to grow. And, Lost Masters is certainly a book that will open a lot of people's eyes. And I'm curious, within the last minute that we have here, is there a website people can find out more about you and your work and Lost Masters, the book?
I'm just in the process of starting to create a website. It'll be lostmasters.com, but we're still putting that up. But what you can do in the meantime, check out the book. Lost Masters, Rediscovering the Mysticism of the Ancient Greek Philosophers. You can get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Indie Books, or support your local bookshop. If they don't have it already, they'd be happy to order it for you. But, I mean, just one thing after another, I guarantee it will blow your mind. I'll just mention one more thing. Iamblichus. A lot of people in the New Age movement, they're interested like in channeling or contacting discounted entities. Now, whether you believe that those are real entities or whether you think that they're projections of the unconscious. But Iamblichus had a lot to say about this, and I'll tell you about that in my book. As he points out, some of these entities or energies are benign, but others are definitely not. And he explains how to tell the difference. He also warns how spiritual practice can shade over into sorcery, when your ego gets involved. And he explains, about performing rituals to help you align yourself not just mentally but also physically with the divine forces. So, I mean, there's just so much in the ancient Greeks. It just, I couldn't even believe it. It was incredible.
Well, it sounded like an incredible time as you researched and put this out there, and it's just as enjoyable to read for the listeners out there. Book is Lost Masters. Our guest joining us today, Linda Johnson. Linda, I want to thank you for taking the time out to join us and share this with our listeners today. Exciting stuff.
Daniel, thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in Beyond 50 as well as upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.